perfect. Thank you. Sorry. We're going to start our next, sorry everybody, at least I know you're awake. We're going to start our next session at about 5 minutes, so I want to ask the moderators and panelists to come forward, and they can get themselves settled and organized, but we'll start in about 5 minutes.
Sorry, I'm just trying to see if my computer's plugged. It's not. I'm going to introduce and then we'll see.
Is the film running from this computer?
No, I'm gonna just say welcome, and then they're gonna put the film on. Yeah. Yes, it is. Thank you. Amazing. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're now about to start session 5 of today, of the Day on Reimagining Conservation of Human Rights. And this session will be on how do you measure the recognition and implementation of human rights in the GBF. It's really important that human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are reflected in the way we measure and monitor the framework. So we're going to be talking about that today, together with Forest Peoples Program, which is running this session, and who will share reflections about the analysis of indicators that has been done by the Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, as well as the Human Rights and Biodiversity Informal Group. So we're actually going to start with a short film, which is a film from the local biodiversity outlooks on the Ojek people and community monitoring. So yeah, if we could put the film up, that would be excellent.
They say they want to evict this community from here in order to conserve. To come and conserve what? Nothing has been destroyed here. I mean, the forest itself was very intact. How did it come up to today that it looks like that? Was it not under conservation? If this forest remained up to this time like it is, had it there not been conservation here? Because that question would have been answered by my great-great-grandfather who died here. Since time immemorial, we have conserved. And we are continuing conserving.
Kruptake olorimo komungto biik kole makeripto wanyamanik chechocho keribe kikemapen kebenoshek kemapen bolo ko sangdap tegandet komi olo mwengoshek olo kumnyate alafu komi olo keremeche sokbeko komi olo kebute ngwek sikenget kekuru keite kanyok churuchut kimicho kipoyorabana ambu kiekyan yo kiimuche ngerekyin bioro ko sasa kama yoche kasa sasa kiekemapan cheka sasa le ndiko takisao takemiranya sao.
The environment here tells you about the people themselves. My livelihood depends on this land.
Ku iyo saru sasa mngegone. Ku get sasa nye unyi tinyi. Pas kate chata ku yo wapito. Mi besien ne ko nulo bataptet kate chata tokun. Kuyu kala ketet kutanga taptet kulele. So ngat sasa get tie labo mngegone mane.
Kiyekone sike korutuka kabanali ko ndoi no babeshen nye majo tuka ngcho nyanda unye pele kasi akwani kumela wali rinyoli ama wale wunyoli yasi kas mbayi kas ijak chinyanya lunyara wali rinyi wale ijak kengenye wala sa kalak churu ju asa igasa sige ju ubara sige ju sasa kodonget chebe ngikase yo ata kunyi sasa ikose kunyi takwata kungacho sasa ibore lata wikimbili mnagete.
So human beings must try to learn also actually the requirements of other animals. But go to the other areas where other people own. Every time you find an elephant having been speared, having been arrowed, having been killed by a bullet, in fact, elephants themselves are now realizing and getting to know that which area is kind for them to be.
Aja warwak ole raptai tuga gabel wala agettai as aga ole rapchindos yo agere tuga kwagere gabel angiki kana inga jata agere mebere ketinga waswas aga tuga
Sigema panalo reis in vele go gelbo kyo vele so ko sorwe kingerele ipurnei wanyamani ipurnei vele alafu sio mire wakati nakyo vele kumebere kemra gelda nyore sine vele soru sige riba ge sasa yoga kinget sasa lo reis sine vele mayes la giri pa la nesuma kwa bigo jut jogi indafia na go bolo iburne vele.
When they say they want to conserve, they are not saying truth because they want to come here evict us and then poach out the resources, the natural resources around here today as we are seeing. Neighboring parts of this land that it has been taken away by the so-called agents of conservation. After clearing the then indigenous trees, they bring in exotic trees. No animal is grazing there today. I don't know whether they forget that we are a part of the ecosystem ourselves. The Agia community are a part of the ecosystem.
Seruet ngalecho pa mapping bu kamastani bu kuyu abu ologama ologi kebelet ngole kebelet bo kugage tulumane kenyo ko serwen ngale ga mapping ko ge gotu korenyo ko barwet le nyenyo korere kamani ma champitan ko mangere kiyogo yo mamin amin bicholi ni anga adalo ko kyu kumunyoli ni aga imbumso ron kyaju rugur Kuman bicho liri nya guyu kore nyeri nyeri po.
So that was a film from the local biodiversity outlooks. I think it was a good way to land into the second session on indigenous peoples and local communities' contributions to measuring and monitoring. So actually now I would like to invite a few of you to come on stage. Mauricio, it would be also great to have Jessica on stage and Christina. How many seats do we have? 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And Noel. And Abigail? Okay, I'm going to introduce everyone. So, indicators will be really central to monitoring the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and crucial to measure the progress towards the established objectives. Parties have increasingly recognized the vital role that indigenous people and local communities play in the CBD and the synergies between biodiversity and human rights. And it's critical that indicators related to the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities and to human rights-based approaches are reflected in the monitoring framework. So in this next hour, or a bit less, we're going to be presenting reflections from different groups of people around that have been working around human rights in the indicators. And we're going to start by hearing from Maurizio, who is next to me here, who's from Forest Peoples Program and is part of the IIFB working group on indicators. And then we're going to be hearing about different people on the key goals and targets that we've been focusing on and that we're really trying to push for integration of human rights for. So yeah, I will hand over to Mauricio first to start us off.
Yeah, is on? Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. I'm gonna present mostly on the process that has happened in the last, especially 12 months, since the meetings in Geneva of SAPSTA 24, when the monitoring framework was discussed, at least the headline indicators were discussed quite in detail, and then how the process has moved from that meeting to where we are now and the negotiations that we are having here this week. So let's see whether it works. Yeah, okay. So as Lou said, I'm with the Forest Peoples Program. I'm working very closely with my colleague, Joji Carino, an indigenous leader from the Philippines, as coordinators of the IFB working group on indicators. So the IFB has been having this group for a number of years, but they have really started to focus on the indicators for the post-2020 since last year through participation in some of the online meetings of SAPSTA 24, and then with the in-person meeting in Geneva in March 2022. At that meeting, the IFB Working Group on Indicators engaged very actively, and as a result of that, several indicators related to indigenous peoples and local communities proposed by IFB were included in the outcome of that meeting, and you can find those in the document SAPSTA 24/2. So it's the recommendations coming from that meeting. It includes a long table with indicators that were proposed by parties and observers. Those indicators then, what SAPSTA decided at that time was to establish an expert meeting on indicators to assess whether those indicators put on the table in Geneva were fit for purpose for the post-2020 GBF. So there are a number of criteria. For example, whether there is data available, whether the indicator is already well developed, and whether, for example, there are agencies, there are so-called custodian agencies that already collect data for those related indicators. Along with many other proposed indicators, these IFB proposed indicators were assessed at the Bonn Expert Workshop, partly due to the criteria being applied, for example, the readily available methodology and data. Most of them were not assessed as being fit to be headline indicators. You might know that there is a very limited list of headline indicators that the parties want to agree on at this COP, so that they can be already operationalized in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans and in the national reports in the next years. And then there is a longer list of draft component and complementary indicators that parties can select whether or not to use, depending on national circumstances. So many of those indicators proposed by IFB, for example, are more in the component and complementary draft list. Now, what is important to point out from the expert meeting in Bonn, which is contained in table 1 of that report, is that if you see on the right side column, and with the text target 21 highlighted in yellow. What that means is that the headline indicators being developed under target 21, which is on the rights of indigenous people and local communities and on the participation of IPLCs, women and youth, and also it includes access to justice and protection of environmental and human rights defenders. So those indicators are actually relevant to many of the targets and goals of the post-2020 GBF. So this is just a snapshot, for example, of target 1, 2, and 3, and these were the proposed headline indicators from Geneva. In the middle column is the assessment. If it is a 1, it means that there is methodology available and it's kind of ready to be rolled out. If it is a 2, means that it is relevant, is an indicator relevant to the target, but it needs development. If it is 3, it means that it hits the target pretty well, but it needs a lot of further development. And so what it shows here that those targets, for example, on land tenure and participation, are relevant to, for example, target 1, 2, and 3. But if we go, for example, to the next slide, when we come to the indicators that came from Geneva on participation, which is the first one there, and then on land tenure, which is the second one here, if you look at the column on the right side, it says they are relevant to all the goals and targets. So we felt that this actually is a strong message coming from the Bonn expert meeting to say that whenever headline indicators are being proposed and operationalized for the various goals and targets, those indicators on participation and land tenure actually need to be taken into account. So they are cross-cutting. Okay. Now, another table that is important from the Bonn report is the so-called Table 4, which is identification of gaps. There was one full day dedicated in the Bonn meeting to check whether there are major gaps left in indicators available in relation to the text in the goals and targets. So for example, here, if we look at goal B, and goal B in Geneva and in Nairobi still contain language on human rights-based approaches and the rights to a healthy environment. One of the gaps that was identified in Bonn was to the indicators related to human rights. So it means that further work needs to be happening on that arena. Likewise, for target 3, and of course there is a huge discussion on target 3 and the 30 by 30, there is a headline indicator on the coverage of protected areas and OECMs and by key biodiversity areas and the effectiveness. What was identified as a gap, as a major gap, was the issue of governance and equity and the relationship of indigenous people and local communities territories to OECMs. So those are areas for further development and to be addressed. The same is the case for target 15. That's the target on business and biodiversity. There is a draft headline indicator, but it needs quite a lot of development. And one of the areas that needs attention is to measure the human rights elements of that draft target. So what are the impacts of business on IPLCs and human rights and biodiversity? And we feel that those two tables are actually very important and needs to be taken into account in the negotiations here, because otherwise there is a risk that they may be forgotten and then there is a rush to adopt readily available indicator without addressing these key elements and gaps, basically. So we feel, for example, that the column on the linkages to other goals and targets in Table 1 of the Bonn report that highlights the relevance of cross-cutting indicators should be addressed in the draft decision that is being discussed here in relation to the monitoring framework. At the moment, this issue is not included in the draft decision. So we are trying to find a way to get it incorporated. And the other one is the gaps highlighted in Table 4 that are also not fully reflected in the draft decision. Now, there was a Friends of the Chair meeting 2 days ago addressing the draft decision on the monitoring framework, including the terms of references for an ad hoc technical expert group to work between COP15 and COP16 to do further work on the monitoring framework, with the objective to have the full monitoring framework to be adopted by COP16. However, there is still the objective to adopt the headline indicators here by the end of next week. So what was presented, not really presented, but what was said at the end of that meeting was that there is also now a third document available that will be part of the negotiations, along with the bond report and with the COP15/2 document, which contains the draft decision with the whole monitoring framework. And this is a streamlined version of what was produced in Bonn. It's called Co-Chairs Workshop paper. It's produced by the UK and Ghana, because they were the two co-chairs of the Bonn expert meeting. And many of us came to know about its existence only 2 days ago. So yesterday we had a look at it. It's a streamlined version. Basically, all those indicators that were categorized as number 3, which needs a lot of development, they've been taken out from the table 1 and put in a separate table for further development, so they wouldn't be considered as headline indicators in this COP. Those include 3 quite important indicators for indigenous peoples and local communities, and as well as women and youth, actually. One is on trends in traditional occupations, which was already proposed as a headline indicator there. It's a category 3, so it's been moved out of table 1. The other one is an indicator on biodiversity information and monitoring, including traditional knowledge with free prior informed consent and scientific knowledge, which is related to target 20. So that's also not being considered as a headline indicator now. And then is the one that here I think is relevant to everybody, is the full and effective participation of indigenous people, local communities, women and youth. It is considered to be still an undeveloped indicator. And so it's been moved out from the table 1 that would adopt the headline indicators. Right. No, it's not moving. Okay. I'll look there then. So this, for example, is a snapshot on target 20, 21, and 22 from that streamline table. As we can see, there is no additional headline indicator proposed for target 20. There is no proposed participation indicator, which was the 21.2. And the proportion of total adult population with secured tenure rights to land is in, because it's already an SDG indicator with methodology and data. And so that's safe, but the other have been removed. Okay, so I think reflecting with the IFB yesterday, these are still some of the key outstanding issues that need to be addressed in the monitoring framework. How to include indicators on the following elements. So on human rights, and we will have some discussion here on the human rights indicators. One on the implementation of the plan of action on customary sustainable use, which is very relevant to target 5 and target 9. Traditional occupation that was already in for target 9. Community protocols on ABS, which are relevant to goal C and target 13. Direct funding to support IPLCs action on the ground, which is related to resource mobilization in target 19. Traditional knowledge and FPIC for target 20. Then participation, access to justice, and protection of environmental human rights defenders for target 21. So these are still areas where further work needs to be done. Right. Here I'm going to share on that issue of the cross-cutting nature of Target 21. We have been working with the International Land Coalition in the past couple of months. And actually, if you have further questions or more details on this, we have the expert here sitting around with us, which is great, from ILC. This is a brainstorming exercise to see on how the headline indicator on secure land tenure for IPLCs in Target 21 can be operationalized, for example, for Target 1 on biodiversity inclusive spatial planning, on Target 2 on ecosystem restoration, and on Target 3 on conservation of biodiversity, and on Target 8 on resilience to climate change. So one way would be to define how the secure land tenure indicator applies to these various targets. For example, on how IPLC tenure can be considered as an indicator of biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. For example, through the community maps and the community plans that the communities themselves are developing. For Target 2 is on how it can be used to secure as an enabler for restoration activities by IPLCs. For Target 3, on how it is a prerequisite actually for inclusive conservation, both as an enabler and also a safeguarding indicator. And then for Target 8 on resilience to climate change, as a safeguard and enabler in terms of IPLC's contributions to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So we won't have time to go into much details here, but it can be applied using variables related to as peoples-based, because that's the nature of the SDG 142, but it can also be applied in the concept of a CBD and in the concept that we are discussing here as an area-based indicator. For example, the number of hectares designated or claimed by IPLCs and recognized. And there are various sources available. So the International Land Coalition is doing really extremely useful work here to see on how this particular indicator on land tenure can be operationalized in several of the targets. Okay, yes, my last slide is the next steps in the process. And this is relevant to really the negotiations that will be happening here in the next few days, and then in the ATEG between COP15 and COP16. So the friend of the chair, meeting 2 days ago, decided to ask the chair of the working group 1 to set up either another friend of the chair or to extend the mandate of that friend of the chair that met to really have an in-depth discussion on the indicators and also the overall monitoring framework. So not to see each indicator in its specific place, but also to see where major gaps are and what is the overall strategy to address the monitoring framework. Now, in internal discussion, we've been feeling that if, and we don't know whether that will happen or not, it's up to the parties, but if the streamlined proposal by the UK and Ghana becomes the basis for negotiation, maybe an option could be that COP15 could adopt a limited amount of indicators, but then allow COP16 to add headline indicators, in 2 years' time, so there would be sufficient time to develop those indicators to fill the gaps that have been identified. This one has to be actually taken into the context of how it relates to the development of MBSAPs, and the process of national reporting, because one of the pressure here of time is that there is a pressure to adopt the headline indicators so that the MBSAPs can be, rolled out and can be reviewed as soon as possible. So we need to see, technically how we can make it a fast process, but also allow sufficient flexibility to fill the gaps that have been identified. And then the third point is that we really need to ensure that there is adequate and balanced composition of the ad hoc technical expert group that will meet between COP15 and COP16 to ensure that there is a presentation of diverse knowledge systems, possibly an increased representation of indigenous peoples and local communities, and also, I think, a more balanced composition between natural and social sciences, with expertise on human rights as well. So I think that's where I end here, and that's where I think the negotiation is at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mauricio, for this really good overview of the process around the monitoring framework of the GBF. I think it's really good that you highlight all this important intersessional work and the Bonn expert workshop and all the work that was done that, particularly all the gaps that were identified in relation to social elements, social impacts and elements related to human rights. And also that you highlight the process as what is happening in the negotiations now and what will come after COP15 as well, because there will still be a lot of work to be done. I realized I didn't introduce myself, and my name is Lou, and I'm from Swedbio at Stockholm Resilience Center, but I'm also part of the informal human rights in biodiversity working group, as are many of the people on this panel today. And we're a group of a broad group of diverse organizations and people that also includes representatives from the Youth, Women and Indigenous Peoples Caucus, who've been working for many, many years to strengthen the links between the biodiversity and human rights agenda. And the group was formalized in a workshop in Chiang Mai in 2019. So now we're actually going to hear from a few contributions on specific goals and targets, and we're going to start with Noel Kumpel, who's from BirdLife International, and will talk to us about the issues around the indicators for Goal B.
Thank you, Lou. I think this is. Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. No? Is that working? Right. Oh yeah, it's now. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm just trying to see what's behind me here. So yeah, just to quickly start with and follow on there in terms of the importance of specifically the right to a healthy environment. So we want the framework to fully respect, protect and fulfill human rights, but specifically this right to a healthy environment, which has now been a change from last time we met. It's now been recognised by the UN General Assembly as a universal human right in July, following on from the Human Rights Council recognition in October last year. And also it's been acknowledged by in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan at COP27. So we now have a much stronger case, as if ever one was needed, for it to be integrated into the Global Biodiversity Framework. So at the moment it's in B bis, the reference is in B bis, so that's good. But it was in the Nairobi text in Goal B. It's now on the edge, sort of as a footnote at the moment. So we want to see this, see the right to healthy environment back into Goal B, and this indicator is one very key reason why it should be there, because it's a tangible, measurable outcome of the sustainable use of biodiversity alongside the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a really top-level outcome of the Global Biodiversity Framework and being nature positive by 2030. In our first session today, we had a video from David Boyd, and it was kind of flagged as well. So David Boyd being the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the environment, and he's going to be coming, he's been zooming in remotely into various sessions at the moment, but he'll be here in person from tomorrow. But we sort of talked about the fact that across the UN system, the right to health environment is almost at meta level. And with this new, with it now being recognised as a universal right, it's being implemented, and lots of thinking is going on within the UN system on how to now integrate it across the MEA frameworks. And there's an event this evening I'd encourage you all to go to, being organised by different UN agencies, which will go into this in more detail. So there's an enormous impetus to ensure that this is properly reflected and integrated through the Global Biodiversity Framework as central to that process. So that's where we get the phrase fulfilling the right to healthy environment back into Goal B, and then here are the ways we can measure that as a kind of chapeau for the wider human rights-based approach. So the first sort of binary indicator which would look at the number of countries, so this is the second one, the number of countries which recognise the right to a healthy environment through their national constitution, laws, or as signatories, as parties to legally binding treaties. That's a very simple indicator that we already have 156 countries that fall into that category. So it would simply be, and that's being reported by the UN Special Rapporteur, so that can very easily be tracked annually through that sort of process. So that's kind of our first stop indicator, but that, as it is, doesn't qualify as a headline indicator because it falls into this binary category. So that's good, we don't want to lose it, but it's not the headline. The one above, or the amendment to the one above, is the headline indicator that is in the process being developed, and we want to, as Maurizio said, is something that needs a bit more development, or has it been quite recently proposed, so may not make it into the headlines that are agreed now, or not in the current state, but is something that we can certainly bring in as one of the additional headline indicators to fill gaps. So that is, as you can see, we've amended this because essentially, so it came about from a review of national biodiversity strategies and action plans that was presented in March at the open-ended working group in Geneva, in fact, by the UN Office for the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So they launched this report looking at how rights were, a collection of 12 different rights were reflected through MBSAPs. And so that makes the basis, essentially a baseline for reviewing that over time and being able to see how different elements of human rights are reflected in MBSAPs over time, and we can therefore track that at national and then global level. And then when we look at national reports, then we can see how that's actually being implemented as well as being planned. So that's the basis of this report, this indicator, and you see we've amended that to make it sort of a bit clearer the extent to which human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, which is listed as one of those rights, are integrated into national biodiversity planning, policies and reporting. So we see that as something that's not, fairly simple to continue in that and develop, and gives a really tangible and explicit way of measuring this fulfillment of the right to a healthy environment under Goal B. And as I said, it measures different types of rights, sort of substantive and procedural rights as part of that process. And those can then be disaggregated. We can disaggregate that composite indicator, and then that will help us to track different rights across the targets, which in themselves won't necessarily qualify as headlines. So that one headline indicator can help us to track this wider human rights-based approach across the framework. So any support for that, and we basically need to make sure that we have the right in Goal B, and then to demonstrate we can measure it through this indicator. So they kind of go hand in hand, but we feel like there is a very strong case for that being a good solid headline indicator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noelle. So now we're going to hear from Jessica Campese, who's an honorary member from the ICCA consortium, and who's going to talk through target 3 as an obvious target where, where indicators from a human rights-based approach are very important. Over to you, Jessica.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we know that implementation of Target 3 will have potentially profound impacts on human rights, equity, and sustainability, and it's also not being implemented in a vacuum. It's going to be implemented in cultural and political and ecological landscapes with existing systems of protected areas and conserved areas under diverse governance systems and types, where there are extensive territories and areas governed by indigenous peoples and local communities that have made and continue to make outstanding, outsized contributions to global conservation, often without recognition and often under threat, where there are far too many protected areas that get counted despite a lack of effectiveness, And as we've heard over and over today and throughout the week, where there are historical and ongoing injustices being carried out in the name of conservation, including through violent evictions and attacks on environmental rights defenders. And we know from all this experience that it's imperative that implementation of Target 3 be monitored through robust measures that ensure accountability for an implementation approach that is human rights based, that is equitable in process and outcome, and that enables the appropriate recognition and support of the visions, priorities, and contributions, governance, and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, not only as a matter of justice, but also as a critical pathway to sustainability. And this can be done both through monitoring all of the elements of Target 3 and in connection with the other goals and targets, as Mauricio was pointing out earlier. I think in monitoring, there's a tendency to focus on what seems the simplest to monitor and what we feel like we already know how to do. And Target 3 includes some elements that at face value or at first seem harder to get our heads around. But if we, right now, as Mauricio pointed out, the current approach leaves major gaps. It leaves out huge and important elements of Target 3, including in relation to equitable governance and to the recognition of diverse approaches to conservation. And if we focus solely on where and how, or where and how much territory is conserved, we invite the risk of not only including in the target areas that embed injustice, but we're not meeting the target. We're not meeting what we've set out to do. And we do have ways that we already have, that are already there, and that can be further developed to monitor and report on all of the elements of Target 3. And those are spoken to and reflected in the text recommendations that are different on the screen. But so there's two here. So the first is a proposal to include disaggregation by governance type in the current headline indicator. And the thinking here is that this addition very much and clearly already meets the criteria for headline indicators, because it is information that is already being collected through the World Database of Protected Areas. And there are ways to improve on that, right? So the current information that we have, the current data that's being collected on governance type, tells us a little bit about the extent to which diverse governance approaches are being recognized and supported, including governance by indigenous peoples and by local communities. And we know also that the ways in which that information on governance type is reported and collected, and even the ways in which we understand what governance type means and how it relates to diversity, how it relates to human rights recognition, can be improved upon. And there are processes being convened to do that, which we can talk a little bit more about. The second proposal is, we think, also in line with the criteria, but goes farther to include all of the elements of Target 3, because all of those elements are what are required in order to meet the targets. And there are a diversity of existing methods, approaches to understanding, better understanding, assessing the state of governance quality and equity, and to identifying pathways for its improvement, and to holding ourselves accountable to that. So we do have ways as well to monitor these other elements. Some of them will also be, many of them will continue to be developed. We'll continue to learn through the process what approaches are the most effective, what approaches are the most equitable. But these are ambitious and practical additions to the targets based on methods, approaches that exist and that we can further develop, and that will help us ensure implementation and monitoring that fully meets the responsibilities and the vision and the ambition in the target, including respect, protection, and support for fulfillment of human rights.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Indeed, 30 by 30 is a very flawed target if human rights are not respected, and if we don't fully recognize the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities. And yeah, thanks for showing us also that methods exist to include elements related to equity and human rights. Now we are going to hear from Christina Egghenter from WWF International, who will talk about monitoring of Target 10.
Yes. Hello? Yes? It's on, but hello? Yes. Good? Closer? Okay. Thank you. I'll try to be brief, noting that this target is very important because, as we know from IPE's report and other other reports, land use conversion and agricultural, industrialized monocropping agriculture is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, and is also displacing the livelihoods and the territories of many indigenous people and local communities, and undermining the resilience of small-scale farming that actually to this day is still feeding the world. So we have all this complexity around Target 10. It's also very complex because as production, addressing production under sustainable use in Goal B, so we have forestry, aquaculture, and agriculture, if not mistaken, in it. How can we have one headline indicator covering everything? So given the complexity and also the high risks, elements of this target, from a human rights point of view, we see a good indicator could be a proxy to get into making sure that some of the key elements, such as the interest, especially the rights and needs of small-scale producers, fishers, and farmers are somewhat reflected. It's gonna be, needs to be agroecology in Target 10. That's what we would like to see, of course, and we would like to see also to have a strong safeguard on, or qualifier on productivity as long-term. Resilience is already there, so that's what we have. But in terms of indicators, what else can we do in order to reflect the interests and rights of these other rights holders? So what we, the present indicator is taken from the SDGs. Actually, forgot which targets precisely, 2.4, maybe one of the targets under Goal 2. It is proportion of agricultural area under sustainable agroecological production. So it would be of interest to this group to propose that more specific reference to agroecology be in the indicator. However, there is also the question, what are the means of verification that we're going to use when we're going to measuring the targets? So that is a discussion that will need to happen, and maybe a technical level if the ad hoc technical group is convened and looking at the database for this. Another suggestion that we have is around the Agro Biodiversity Index, which is actually data available. It was initiated by Biodiversity International as an exercise, and it sort of connects and bridges across the issue of production, but also genetic resources and nutrition. So it's also of interest to Target 16. And I was thinking, as you were talking and presenting, Maurizio, that would be very interesting, this cross targets or cross indicators. I mean, indicators talking to many relevant, this is something that really needs to be further investigated or analyzed, but also promoted, because it's very interesting. So traditional occupations could be a very interesting one for target 10, because it's not just about the income of small-scale farmers, which is in the SDGs, but it's also about maintaining their indigenous food systems. And as we know, the traditional cyclical agriculture, instead of calling it shifting agriculture, is a main issue, is a traditional occupation, and is also at risk of being criminalized under certain legal regimes. So that would be interesting. And then, of course, the proposal for a binary indicators of number of countries who have national legislations that support farmer seed system. And that is a crucial one. It'll be difficult politically, but it's a basic foundational one, because that's where you have your agrobiodiversity. I will stop here because we have more targets to go through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, for highlighting the importance of small-scale food producers. So now we're going to hear from Abigail Kitma, who's from Teptaba, and she's also part of the IAFB. And she's going to talk about Target 15. We're running a little bit out of time, so I'm really sorry, but I'm going to ask the next panelist to try and keep it brief. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try my best. But obviously, human rights and the environment is very intertwined, if not obvious, from the video of the Ogiek peoples and also of the adoption of the right to a safe and healthy environment. Therefore, this target on businesses and biodiversity really needs to have to take into account, human rights and human rights due diligence, according to in line with what is stated in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which says that businesses have the responsibility to identify, assess, and address impacts they have on human rights. Unfortunately, the target is still under discussion right now, and the element of human rights based is, also still under discussion. But we really think that this is an important element that has to be highlighted at all levels, from the headline indicator, the complementary, and we also have even a suggestion for a binary indicator, and that's why we have it there. So it's all red because they're all very new. Because unfortunately, the indicators suggested as it stands now only talks about the risks of, I think, biodiversity to business. So it doesn't really take into account, it's not a really holistic approach, and it would not address the drivers of biodiversity loss. So another strategy that we have in general, not only in this target, but also in other targets, is to have binary indicators, which are just yes or no indicators. And usually, it's about the existence or non-existence of laws or policy in relation to that target. So for Target 15, we also have a proposed binary indicator, which is about number of countries with national laws and policies requiring companies to undertake human rights due diligence according to the UN Guiding Principles and other relevant standards. So ideally, it would reflect in the national report as something that countries would answer when they have to report. So these are all still strategies that we hope to push in the discussions to this meeting. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. And we're going to have a quick switch of panelists, but a round of applause for our panelists that are here. And I'd like to invite Tina to the stage, and also Eva and Gino, or yes. Yes. So Eva Hershaw from the International Land Coalition and Gino Cocharo from Natural Justice will run us through the importance of indicators related to human rights in Target 21.
Hello. Hi. I don't have text and you won't be reading what I'm saying, but I'm Eva Hershaw. I'm speaking on behalf of the International Land Coalition and specifically to an indicator, a proposed indicator on land and environmental defenders, environmental human rights defenders under Target 21. So this, in the presentation that Maurizio gave, in the scenario that we go with the streamline headline indicators approach, this would be an indicator that would not be included under Target 21. And what we are proposing is the inclusion of an indicator, an established SDG indicator. For those of you who follow the SDGs, SDG 16. SDG indicator 16.10.1 is on the verified cases of killings, harassments, arbitrary detention, torture of human rights advocates, including trade unionists and journalists. Under the human rights defenders category are land and environmental defenders. So this is an SDG indicator with an established methodology. OHCHR is the custodian of this indicator, and there's data. We know that between 2015 and 2019, they collected data for more than 80 countries on this indicator, accounting for nearly 2,000 killings of human rights advocates, trade unionists, and journalists. Currently, OHCHR is not publishing this data at the national level for questions of representation or representativity of the data because it's richer in some regions compared to others. But despite this, they've estimated that half of the cases are cases of land and environmental defenders. So they've recognized that within this group of human rights defenders, land and environmental defenders, IPLCs are overwhelmingly or disproportionately represented. And that there is an aspiration to further disaggregate this data to the national level and also to the level that we would be able to extract meaningful information about environmental human rights defenders. So other actors are working on this. There's a civil society data working group under Allied, the Allied Coalition, that's working on a data set on land and environmental defenders, including non-lethal attacks. OHCHR as well has been very collaborative, is working with civil society data collectors on this, and also shares the aspirations of being able to make environmental human rights defenders visible within this data set. It's a robust data set, still under development, but believe it would be an important indicator to include and one with SDG methodology and community around it under Target 21. Thanks.
Thanks, Eva.
Yeah, hi everyone. Gino from Natural Justice. I've pushed myself in here because I think we do want just a very brief input on access to justice as well as a standalone. I mean, I think as we think that through, there are a lot of methodologies already when it comes to this in terms of access to justice, thinking through the World Justice Project, for example, and the work that they've done and the data sets. And as mentioned here, looking at the recognised rights of public participation, access to information, which are clearly key when tracking access to justice, and of course the availability of different mechanisms that exist for citizenry to use. I mean, going even further, I know we've got compliance with international norms, but even being able to track with regulatory bodies, environmental regulatory bodies at a national level, and even the judiciary, courts, in terms of the number of cases, violations which have been reported as well, and compliance issues on environmental matters. Okay.
Thank you, Gino. And our last panelist for today is Tina Rai, who will talk to us about indicators related to Target 22. Tina is from Women for Biodiversity and the Women's Caucus.
Well, thank you to be here. I'm going to keep it very short. So I think as you all know, that in the Global Biodiversity Framework, now we have the Biodiversity Framework is of 22 targets. It's not a new target. So the target 22 is on gender equality. And until the working group, which was just before this was almost a clean text. We were able to kind of clean it up. It also includes have rights to lands and natural resources. So that was quite surprising, of course, but really very good to be able to see the push of parties of really taking the target forward. So that was a really nice way. But of course, as some of you have been following from the working group discussions around the bracket on responsiveness. Now coming to the global biodiversity discussion, the COP15, the targets have not been opened up yet again to just go through what they were going to be doing. But alongside the headline indicators, so just kind of giving a brief timeline. So the Target 22 became a part of the Global Biodiversity Framework in Nairobi, where it was part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So going forward, as I like to tell people, going forward for Nairobi, the GBF had 22 targets. Right after the Nairobi meeting, literally like just after 2 days after that, the Bonn Indicators Workshop was organized in Bonn. The discussion around Bonn was prepared before the Nairobi meeting had taken place. So the discussion documents and the list of indicators that were proposed in that meeting document was actually limited to only 21. However, taking on the development that just 3 days before that, Nairobi had adopted the Target 22 in its report, gave us an opportunity to take that discussion forward in Bonn. So based on the Nairobi outcome, we were able to start the discussion that's saying that, look, let's not wait. Target 22 is already there. It's in the outcome report. You are doing the indicators work here. So we have to work because it's not even in brackets. So that's how we got the discussion on Target 22 in the Bonn meeting. And hence you see the mention of Target 22 in the outcome report of the Bonn. Now, for that one, the limitation was that the guidance given to the workshop participants was to only use the index that was provided for the meeting. So if you look at the report, you will see the indicator proposed, the headline indicator proposed for Target 21 and 22 are the same. And you have a binary indicator for Target 22, which I think Mauricio also shared. So I just wanted to bring to attention is that the reason, so what the Women's Caucus is asking for, and I'm also really happy to see the reflection of it in the paper of UK and Ghana, is the proposal to say that the binary indicator proposed in the outcome report of the Bonn meeting, including being in the draft decision document of the Global Biodiversity Framework, that the binary indicator proposed, which is actually in line, or it is the SDGs indicator 5A2, is very relevant to be proposed as a headline indicator for Target 22. So that's that was the proposal, and I'm happy to see the paper of UK and Ghana on that to propose that indicator. Otherwise, there won't be any division if 21 and 22 have the same indicator. We're also worried that they'll be like, okay, you have the same indicator. If the same indicator becomes for two, then well, what is the value of having two different targets? So we want the binary indicator, and there is data on it. The guardianship is under the FAO. The data is collected every 2 years, and the latest data being of 2019. So why will we waste another 2 years in the next COP to try to have another new indicator, which may take another 10 years to be developed, because that's what happened in the ICHA. the list of indicators for the ICHA only came out in Cancun. So that was literally like one COP before the post-2020 discussion was going to happen. So anyways, that's it. So target 22, binary indicator, headline indicator. That's the key message. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tina. Hope the commitment to Target 22 continues into the monitoring framework as well. Sorry for running a little bit over time. This is actually the end of our event, and I want to thank all the panelists very much and say that let's remember this is a framework about nature and people. Yeah, and this work around the monitoring indicators continues, and you're welcome to come and speak to us if you're interested. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening.